Few figures in history have sparked as much debate and controversy as Nero, the fifth emperor of Rome. His rule, which lasted from AD 54 to AD 68, is remembered for its extravagance, cruelty, and political instability. While some view him as a deranged tyrant who set Rome on fire and murdered his own family, others argue that he was a misunderstood ruler who sought to reform the empire in his own artistic and luxurious vision. Regardless of perspective, Nero's reign marks a critical turning point in Roman history, one that led to the downfall of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and ushered in an era of civil war. Nero was born in AD 37 as Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the son of Agrippina the Younger, a member of the powerful Julio-Claudian dynasty. His mother was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, Rome's first emperor, and she had grand ambitions for her son. When Emperor Claudius, her husband, adopted Nero and made him his heir, her influence over Roman politics grew significantly. At the age of 16, Nero became emperor following Claudius' mysterious death, widely believed to have been orchestrated by Agrippina herself. Initially, his rule was guided by capable advisors, including the philosopher Seneca and the military commander Burrus. Under their guidance, the first few years of his reign were marked by relative stability, with Nero presenting himself as a generous and cultured ruler. He reduced taxes, improved public welfare, and even made efforts to curb corruption in the Senate. However, as he grew older, Nero's darker tendencies emerged. He resented his mother's influence, leading to her eventual murder in AD 59. His obsession with the arts and extravagant performances alienated the elite, while his increasing cruelty led to the executions of many political figures, including his former tutor Seneca. His reign reached a dramatic turning point in AD 64 when the Great Fire of Rome devastated large parts of the city. Rumors spread that Nero had started the fire himself to clear space for his grand palace, the Domus Aurea. Whether or not this was true, Nero's response, blaming Christians for the fire and ordering brutal persecutions, only intensified his unpopularity. By the late 60s AD, opposition against Nero had grown significantly. Revolts erupted in the provinces, and powerful generals like Galba openly defied his rule. The Senate, once under his control, declared him a public enemy. Faced with certain death, Nero fled Rome and ultimately took his own life in AD 68, allegedly uttering the famous last words, "What an artist dies in me." Nero's reign is often remembered as the beginning of the end for the Julio-Claudian dynasty. While his predecessors, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius, had laid the foundations of imperial rule, Nero's actions weakened the legitimacy of the imperial system. His excesses, erratic decision-making, and persecution of both the elite and the common people set the stage for a period of instability. After his death, Rome fell into a year-long civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors, where multiple claimants fought for control of the empire. Despite his negative reputation, Nero did leave a lasting impact on Rome. His patronage of the arts and theater was unprecedented, and his love for Greek culture influenced Roman society for generations. Some scholars argue that Nero's construction projects, including the rebuilding of Rome after the Great Fire, contributed to the city's architectural grandeur. However, his reckless spending drained the treasury, forcing heavy taxation and economic turmoil that persisted after his death. One of the most enduring aspects of Nero's historical legacy is how he has been portrayed. Ancient historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, who were all writing after his death, painted him as a mad tyrant, emphasizing his cruelty, debauchery, and political assassinations. However, modern historians recognize that these accounts may have been influenced by later emperors who wanted to justify his downfall. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Nero was neither a great leader nor the absolute monster depicted in Roman literature, but rather a ruler who was ill-equipped to handle the immense pressures of imperial power. Nero's legacy remains controversial for several reasons. First, his rule is marked by conflicting narratives. On one hand, he is depicted as a ruthless despot who indulged in excess and neglected his duties. On the other hand, some argue he was an artistic visionary whose unorthodox leadership clashed with Rome's conservative elite. His promotion of the arts and his desire to transform Rome into a cultural capital suggest that he had ambitions beyond mere tyranny. Second, many of the most infamous stories about Nero, such as his alleged role in the Great Fire of Rome, are debated among historians. While Tacitus and Suetonius claim that he watched Rome burn while playing the lyre, there is no concrete evidence to support this claim. In fact, some records suggest that he organized relief efforts for victims of the fire. However, his decision to blame Christians for the disaster led to widespread persecution and cemented his reputation as a cruel and vindictive ruler. Third, Nero's treatment of his family and political rivals has led to intense scrutiny. He ordered the execution of his mother, Agrippina, whom he initially relied upon for political guidance. He also eliminated his first wife, Octavia, and later his second wife, Poppaea Sabina, allegedly kicking her to death while she was pregnant. These actions reinforce the image of Nero as a paranoid and violent ruler who saw anyone close to him as a threat. Yet, despite his notoriety, Nero has fascinated artists, writers, and filmmakers for centuries. He has been depicted in literature, plays, operas, and even modern cinema as the ultimate example of a decadent and self-indulgent ruler. His life has inspired characters in historical fiction and dramas, often portraying him as a tragic figure consumed by his own excesses and insecurities. The key themes that define his rule. 1. Tyranny. Nero's rule is often associated with cruelty and repression. His use of executions, political purges, and intimidation ensured his grip on power but also alienated his allies. His increasing paranoia led him to turn against his closest advisors, including Seneca, and ultimately contributed to his downfall. 2. Excess. Nero's love for luxury and entertainment was unparalleled among Roman emperors. He spent vast amounts of money on lavish banquets, elaborate performances, and architectural projects such as the Domus Aurea. While these endeavors showcased his artistic ambitions, they also drained Rome's economy and fueled resentment among the ruling elite. 3. Downfall. The final years of Nero's reign were marked by betrayal and rebellion. His mismanagement of finances, mistreatment of the military, and alienation of the Senate created the conditions for his eventual overthrow. When faced with the loss of power, Nero was unable to rally support and ultimately took his own life, bringing an end to the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Nero remains one of the most infamous and debated figures in Roman history. His rule was a mix of artistic ambition, political cruelty, and self-indulgence, making him a compelling character for historians and storytellers alike. Whether he was a misunderstood reformer or a ruthless dictator, his reign undeniably left a lasting impact on the Roman Empire. As we delve deeper into his life, we will uncover the complexities of his character and the reasons why his name has become synonymous with tyranny and excess. The story of Nero cannot be understood without first examining the world he inherited. Rome before his reign was shaped by a dynasty that traced its origins to Augustus, the first emperor. This was the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a ruling family that combined the lineage of Julius Caesar with that of the Claudian family, both of which held immense influence over Roman politics. The dynasty's rule spanned nearly a century, beginning with Augustus in 27 BC and ending with Nero in AD 68. It was an era marked by both stability and excess, by political genius and tyranny, by military conquest and internal strife. The foundation laid by Augustus established the framework of the Roman Empire, but the rulers who followed, including Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius, each left their own distinct mark on Rome's political landscape. Augustus, originally known as Octavian, was the great-nephew and adopted son of Julius Caesar. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, Augustus emerged victorious in the power struggles that followed, defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. He then consolidated his rule, presenting himself as the restorer of the Republic while subtly transforming Rome into an empire under his control. The Senate granted him supreme power, and he cleverly balanced tradition with absolute rule. His reign brought stability, economic growth, and administrative reforms that would influence Rome for centuries. By the time he died in AD 14, He had secured the empire's frontiers, established a bureaucratic system, and cultivated an image of divine authority. Tiberius, Augustus' stepson and successor, was a capable but deeply unpopular ruler. Unlike Augustus, he had little interest in public spectacle and withdrew from Rome for long periods, preferring the solitude of his villa on the island of Capri. His reign saw increased reliance on the Praetorian Guard, the elite military force that protected the emperor. Under the leadership of the infamous Sejanus, the Guard became a tool for political purges, spreading fear and distrust throughout the Senate. Tiberius' rule, though largely stable, was marked by paranoia and suspicion, setting a precedent for future emperors who would rely on fear to maintain power. Then came Caligula, the great-grandson of Augustus, who took the throne in AD 37. Initially, he was celebrated for his generosity and promises of restoring senatorial authority. However, his reign quickly descended into chaos. Stories of his erratic behavior spread, with rumors that he proclaimed himself a living god, made his horse a priest, and squandered Rome's treasury on extravagant spectacles. While some of these accounts may have been exaggerated by his enemies, his reign was undoubtedly marked by cruelty and excess. His assassination by the Praetorian Guard in AD 41 demonstrated the growing influence of the military in determining who could rule Rome. Caligula's successor, Claudius, was an unlikely emperor. Seen as weak and unassuming, he was overlooked for much of his life due to a limp and speech impediment. However, upon his accession, he proved to be a surprisingly competent ruler. He expanded the empire, most notably by conquering Britain in AD 43, and he made significant administrative reforms. He improved Rome's infrastructure, built new aqueducts, and strengthened the legal system. Despite these accomplishments, he remained heavily influenced by those around him, particularly his wives and freedmen advisors. His marriage to Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mother, would ultimately shape the fate of the empire, as she maneuvered to ensure that her son would be Claudius' heir instead of his biological son, Britannicus. By the time Nero came to power in AD 54, Rome had been ruled by 4 very different emperors, each of whom had left behind a distinct legacy. Augustus had built the empire, Tiberius had ruled it with suspicion, Caligula had nearly destroyed it with madness, and Claudius had worked to strengthen it. Yet, beneath the surface of imperial power, Rome's political structure was increasingly fragile. The Senate, once the center of Roman governance, had become largely ceremonial. Real power lay with the emperor, his advisors, the Praetorian Guard, and the elite families who maneuvered for influence behind the scenes. Imperial rule was not yet fully secure. Each emperor lived under the constant threat of assassination, rebellion, or political intrigue. The fate of the empire often depended on the personality and capabilities of the ruler at the top. Roman society before Nero was a complex hierarchy defined by wealth, status, and patronage. At the top of the social order was the emperor, followed by the senatorial class, the equestrian class, wealthy non-senators, and the vast majority of Roman citizens and slaves. The economy was fueled by agriculture, trade, and conquest. Wealth flowed into Rome from its provinces, enriching the elite while the lower classes often struggled to survive. Gladiatorial games, chariot races, and public spectacles were a way for emperors to maintain public favor, distracting the masses from political instability and economic hardships. The army was another pillar of Roman power. Legions stationed along the empire's borders ensured Rome's dominance over its vast territories. However, the loyalty of the military was not always guaranteed. The Praetorian Guard, originally created as an elite force to protect the emperor, had grown into a political entity capable of making or breaking rulers. The importance of military loyalty became increasingly clear in the years before Nero's reign, as emperors like Tiberius and Claudius depended on the support of the Guard to maintain control. The imperial court was another arena of power and intrigue. The emperor was surrounded by a network of advisors, freedmen, and family members who sought to influence policy and secure their own positions. Claudius' reliance on his wives and freedmen had demonstrated how those closest to the emperor could wield enormous power, often at the expense of the Senate. Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mother, was one of the most ambitious figures in this environment. A descendant of Augustus, she understood the mechanics of power better than most and worked relentlessly to position Nero as the next emperor. Religion and culture also played a crucial role in shaping the empire before Nero. Traditional Roman religion revolved around the worship of gods and ancestors, with state rituals and ceremonies reinforcing the divine authority of the emperor. Augustus had introduced the imperial cult, which elevated the emperor to a semi-divine status, further legitimizing his rule. This practice continued with his successors, who were often deified after their deaths. However, Rome was also home to a wide variety of religious beliefs, with Eastern cults, mystery religions, and emerging sects like Christianity gaining followers. These diverse religious currents would later intersect with Nero's reign in dramatic ways. Culturally, Rome was at a crossroads between tradition and innovation. While Latin literature and Roman engineering flourished, Greek influence remained strong. The ruling elite admired Greek philosophy, art, and theater, and emperors like Nero would later take this admiration to extremes. Public entertainment was an essential part of Roman life, with massive amphitheaters hosting gladiatorial combats, naval battles, and theatrical performances. These spectacles were not just for amusement, they were also a political tool, reinforcing the power of the emperor while keeping the masses entertained. Despite its grandeur, Rome before Nero was a city of contradictions. It was the center of an empire that stretched from Britain to the Middle East, yet its streets were often filled with poverty and crime. It boasted architectural marvels like the Forum and the Colosseum, but also teetered on the edge of social unrest. It was ruled by emperors who claimed divine legitimacy, yet each ruler lived in fear of assassination or rebellion. By the time Nero ascended to the throne, Rome was an empire at its peak but also at a precarious moment in its history. The Julio-Claudian dynasty had established the foundations of imperial rule, but the very nature of this system meant that the stability of the empire depended largely on the character and decisions of the emperor. Rome's political elite had grown accustomed to imperial rule, yet there was always underlying tension between the Senate, the military, and the court. The empire was vast and wealthy, yet the strain of maintaining its borders and keeping its provinces in check was an ongoing challenge. Nero inherited not just the throne, but the legacy of his predecessors, their triumphs, their mistakes, and the fragile balance of power they had built. His reign would be shaped by this world, and in turn he would leave his own indelible mark on Rome's history. Whether through artistic ambition, political paranoia, or sheer excess, Nero would push the limits of what it meant to be emperor, testing the very foundations of the empire he ruled. Nero was born as Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus on December 15, AD 37, in Antium, modern-day Anzio, Italy, a coastal town south of Rome. His birth took place during the turbulent reign of his uncle, Emperor Caligula, a period marked by extravagance, cruelty, and political instability. While he would later be remembered as one of Rome's most infamous emperors, at the time of his birth, there was little indication that he would one day ascend to the throne. His lineage, however, placed him close to the center of power, and his family's ambitions would shape the course of his life. Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, was one of the most influential women in Roman history. She was the daughter of Germanicus, a highly revered general, and Agrippina the Elder, a noblewoman known for her political acumen and loyalty to her family. Germanicus was immensely popular among both the military and the Roman people, and many had once hoped he would succeed Emperor Tiberius. However, his sudden death under suspicious circumstances in AD 19 cut his promising career short, and his widow, Agrippina the Elder, spent the rest of her life opposing Tiberius' rule. Her defiance ultimately led to her exile and eventual death, but her children, including Agrippina the Younger, remained significant figures in Rome's imperial lineage. Agrippina the Younger was a woman of exceptional intelligence, ambition, and ruthlessness. She belonged to the Julio-Claudian dynasty, making her not only a direct descendant of Augustus but also the sister of Emperor Caligula. She had been married off at a young age to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a man from an old and distinguished patrician family. Domitius was notorious for his arrogance and cruelty, The historian Suetonius records that when he was congratulated on the birth of his son, he cynically remarked that any child born to him and Agrippina could only be detestable and a public disaster. Despite his noble heritage, Domitius Ahenobarbus had little direct influence on his son's upbringing. He was a consul in AD 32 but later fell out of favor with the ruling elite. By the time Nero was about 3 years old, his father was accused of political misconduct, stripped of his properties, and exiled. He died in AD 40, leaving Agrippina a widow. This event marked a turning point in young Nero's life, as his mother would now become the dominant force in shaping his future. The political landscape of Rome during Nero's childhood was marked by instability and intrigue. Caligula's reign, AD 37 to 41, was defined by extravagance, erratic behavior, and political purges. His tyrannical rule created many enemies, and in AD 41, he was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. His uncle, Claudius, was unexpectedly declared emperor in the aftermath, largely due to the influence of the Guard, who saw him as a more manageable figure. Claudius was an unlikely ruler. He had been considered weak and unfit for politics due to a limp and a speech impediment. However, once in power, he proved to be an effective administrator and a skilled politician. His reign was characterized by military expansion, including the conquest of Britain in AD 43, and major legal and bureaucratic reforms. Yet, despite his successes, he remained vulnerable to the ambitions of those around him, particularly his wives and advisors. Agrippina the Younger navigated this political landscape with remarkable skill. Following the execution of her first husband, she was briefly married to Gaius Sallustius Picenus Crispus, a wealthy and influential noble. When he died, possibly under suspicious circumstances, she inherited his vast fortune. This financial power gave her the means to maneuver within the imperial court. She was determined to elevate her son to the highest position possible, and when she saw an opportunity to marry Emperor Claudius, she seized it. In AD 49, Agrippina married Claudius, becoming his fourth wife. This marriage was not only politically advantageous but also scandalous by Roman standards, as she was Claudius' niece. To legitimize the union, the Senate had to pass a special decree allowing such a marriage. Agrippina quickly consolidated her power, eliminating rivals and securing influential positions for her allies. Her ultimate goal was to position Nero as the next emperor, despite Claudius having a biological son, Britannicus, from his previous marriage. Agrippina's influence over Claudius was immense. She gained control over many aspects of the imperial administration and ensured that her son received the best possible education. Nero's tutors included Seneca, a renowned Stoic philosopher and statesman, who would later serve as one of his chief advisors. Seneca, along with the Praetorian prefect Sextus Afranius Burrus, played a crucial role in shaping Nero's early political outlook and public persona. They instilled in him a love for literature, oratory, and the arts, interests that would later define his rule. In AD 50, Agrippina achieved a significant victory. Claudius officially adopted Nero, making him the emperor's legal heir. This adoption transformed Nero from a noble with imperial connections into the designated successor of the empire. His name was changed to Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, aligning him more closely with the Julio-Claudian dynasty. From this moment on, he was no longer just the son of Agrippina. He was the heir to the Roman Empire. The adoption of Nero was not merely a ceremonial act. It had profound political consequences. It immediately placed him in competition with Britannicus, who was still Claudius' biological son and a legitimate candidate for the throne. However, Agrippina ensured that Nero received preferential treatment. He was granted titles, given a seat among the imperial elite, and even married to Claudius' daughter, Octavia, further solidifying his place within the ruling family. Britannicus, meanwhile, was increasingly sidelined, with his public appearances restricted and his access to power diminished. Nero's early years as heir apparent were carefully orchestrated by Agrippina. She controlled his interactions with the Senate, arranged for his public appearances, and ensured that he remained in the favor of the Roman people. She cultivated an image of him as a young, promising leader who would continue the legacy of Augustus. Statues and coins bearing his likeness began to circulate, and he was introduced to the Roman elite as a future ruler. Throughout this period, Nero's personal interests also began to emerge. He developed a fascination with music, poetry, and the performing arts, pursuits that were considered unbecoming for a Roman noble, let alone an imperial heir. While his mother and advisors initially indulged these interests as harmless hobbies, they would later become a source of contention and controversy when he took the throne. By the time Nero reached his teenage years, his future seemed assured. He was the adopted son of the emperor, groomed for power, and backed by a formidable political force in the form of Agrippina. However, the stability of his position depended on one crucial factor: Claudius' continued support. If Claudius were to change his mind and favor Britannicus instead, all of Agrippina's careful planning would be undone. In AD 54, an event occurred that would change the course of history. Claudius died, allegedly poisoned by Agrippina. While the exact circumstances of his death remain a matter of debate, many ancient sources suggest that Agrippina orchestrated the assassination to ensure Nero's ascension before Britannicus could come of age. With Claudius gone, Nero, at the age of 16, was declared emperor of Rome. His rule had officially begun, but the real power still lay with his mother. Nero's early life was shaped by the ambitions and machinations of Agrippina the Younger. From his birth into a noble yet vulnerable position, to his rise as the heir to the empire, every step was carefully managed by his mother. The Rome he grew up in was one of political intrigue, shifting alliances, and ever-present danger. While he had been trained in governance, philosophy, and the arts, his true education came from observing the ruthless power struggles that defined imperial politics. As he took the throne, Nero inherited not just the title of emperor but also the expectations, responsibilities, and burdens that came with it. His mother's influence remained strong, and for the first few years of his reign, she continued to shape his decisions. However, as he grew into his role, tensions between them would escalate, leading to one of the most infamous power struggles in Roman history. The young emperor who had once been a pawn in his mother's grand strategy would soon seek to assert his own authority, an ambition that would have deadly consequences. On October 13, AD 54, Emperor Claudius died, an event that would change the course of Roman history. Officially, the cause of death was recorded as natural, but suspicions quickly arose, with many ancient historians suggesting that Agrippina the Younger, his wife and the mother of Nero, had orchestrated his demise. According to some accounts, she poisoned Claudius with a dish of mushrooms, a method often used in political assassinations at the time. Whether or not she was directly responsible, what is clear is that Agrippina moved swiftly to ensure that her son, Nero, was declared emperor before any rival factions could act. Nero, only 16 years old at the time, was immediately presented to the Praetorian Guard, the elite military force that protected the emperor. The Guard, already under the influence of Agrippina, quickly accepted him as the new ruler. The Senate, faced with little choice, ratified the decision, and Nero was officially declared emperor of Rome. This transition of power was unusually smooth, a testament to Agrippina's careful planning and political acumen. However, while Nero had the title, the real power in the early years of his reign lay in the hands of his mother and his advisors. The young emperor was not left to rule alone. Two of the most powerful and influential figures in Rome, the philosopher and statesman Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, took charge of guiding him. Seneca, known for his Stoic philosophy, was tasked with shaping Nero's political and moral outlook. Burrus, on the other hand, controlled the military forces that ensured Nero's authority remained unchallenged. Together, they sought to mold the inexperienced emperor into a capable and just ruler, keeping the excesses of power in check while maintaining stability in the empire. During these initial years, Nero's governance appeared promising. His early rule was marked by an emphasis on justice, moderation, and public welfare. Under Seneca's influence, he presented himself as a ruler who would restore dignity to the empire, distancing himself from the corruption and cruelty of his predecessors. He spoke eloquently before the Senate, promised to uphold the traditions of Rome, and made efforts to curb the excessive power of imperial officials who had grown arrogant under Claudius' rule. His decisions were generally well received, and he gained the goodwill of both the elite and the common people. One of his first major policies was reducing the heavy taxation imposed by Claudius. This decision was immensely popular among the Roman population, as it relieved some of the financial burdens that had weighed upon them. He also took steps to reform the judicial system, ensuring that trials were conducted fairly and that corruption among magistrates was minimized. These measures helped to establish an image of Nero as a benevolent and reform-minded leader. Despite being placed on the throne largely due to his mother's ambitions, Nero soon began to push back against Agrippina's influence. Agrippina had wielded enormous power during Claudius' reign and expected to continue ruling through her son. However, as Nero grew older, he began to resent her control and sought to assert his independence. The first signs of this power struggle became evident in the way Nero handled political appointments. Initially, he consulted his mother on major decisions, but over time, he started making appointments without her approval, favoring his own advisors over her allies. Agrippina's displeasure was not subtle. She openly criticized her son's decisions and even threatened to support Britannicus, the biological son of Claudius, as a potential rival for the throne. Nero, feeling increasingly threatened, acted swiftly. In AD 55, Britannicus died suddenly, reportedly poisoned during a banquet. This event eliminated one of the last potential threats to Nero's rule and sent a clear message to Agrippina that her influence was waning. The relationship between Nero and the Senate during his early years was relatively stable. Unlike his predecessors Caligula and Claudius, who had often treated the Senate with disdain, Nero initially maintained a respectful and cooperative stance. He consulted senators on important matters, sought their approval for new policies, and upheld traditional Republican values in his speeches. This approach won him favor among the political elite, who saw him as a preferable alternative to previous rulers who had marginalized their role in governance. The Praetorian Guard, under the leadership of Burrus, remained loyal to Nero. The Guard had played a crucial role in securing his ascension, and as long as their interests were protected, they had no reason to challenge his rule. Nero understood the importance of keeping the military content, and he ensured that they were well compensated. He also maintained a close relationship with Burrus, relying on him to manage military affairs and suppress any signs of dissent. Among the general population, Nero was immensely popular. He had a natural charm and charisma that set him apart from many of his predecessors. Unlike the reserved and bureaucratic Claudius, Nero was deeply interested in the arts, music, and theater. He made public appearances where he engaged with the people, attended chariot races, and participated in cultural festivals. His love for entertainment resonated with the Roman masses, who saw him as a relatable and modern ruler. One of the most well-received actions of his early reign was the reduction of oppressive legal penalties that had been implemented under previous emperors. He abolished secret trials and limited the use of capital punishment, which was seen as a sign of his commitment to fairness. Additionally, he focused on improving Rome's infrastructure, commissioning new buildings, repairing old ones, and initiating large-scale public works that provided jobs and improved the city's appearance. Despite this promising start, cracks soon began to appear in Nero's rule. His increasing defiance toward Agrippina led to a widening rift between mother and son. Agrippina, once the most powerful woman in Rome, found herself sidelined as Nero made decisions without consulting her. Feeling threatened, she attempted to reassert her influence by forming alliances with senators and military officers who had opposed Nero's growing independence. At the same time, Nero's personal interests began to take precedence over matters of state. While he had initially adhered to Seneca's guidance, he gradually became more indulgent in his artistic passions. His fascination with music, poetry, and acting began to dominate his life, leading to concerns among his advisors that he was neglecting his imperial duties. The Senate, while initially supportive, started to view him with suspicion, fearing that his increasing extravagance would lead to instability. By the end of the first few years of his reign, Nero had successfully established himself as emperor, but the forces that had once supported him were beginning to shift. His mother, once his greatest ally, had become a potential threat. The Senate, while still cooperative, had started to question his long-term leadership. The Praetorian Guard, though loyal, remained watchful. And the Roman people who had embraced him for his youthful energy and promise of reform would soon begin to see a different side of their emperor. The early years of Nero's rule were defined by promise and potential. Under the careful guidance of Seneca and Burrus, he had taken steps toward creating a fairer and more just administration. His initial popularity was undeniable, fueled by his public persona, his engagement with the arts, and his policies aimed at improving the lives of ordinary Romans. However, as his confidence grew, so did his desire for autonomy. The struggle to break free from his mother's control, his increasing obsession with personal pleasures, and the first signs of political instability foreshadowed the darker chapters of his reign. As Rome watched its young emperor evolve, few could have predicted the path he would ultimately take. What began as a reign filled with hope and promise would soon descend into turmoil, excess, and eventual ruin. Nero's transformation from a promising leader to one of the most infamous figures in Roman history was already in motion, even if the full consequences had yet to unfold. Agrippina the Younger was one of the most formidable women in Roman history, wielding power in ways that few could match. As the daughter of Germanicus and the great-granddaughter of Augustus, she carried the weight of Rome's most prestigious bloodline. From the moment she maneuvered her way into marriage with Emperor Claudius, her ambitions were clear. She sought to secure power not for herself alone, but for her son, Nero. When Claudius died under suspicious circumstances, and Nero was declared emperor at the age of 16, it was widely understood that Agrippina was the true ruler of Rome. She controlled the empire with calculated precision. She surrounded herself with allies, eliminating rivals through political maneuvering, exile, or execution. She ensured that key figures in the government remained loyal, including the powerful philosopher and statesman Seneca, who was tasked with advising Nero. Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, was also under her influence, which meant that the military arm of the empire was, at least initially, aligned with her will. In the early years of Nero's reign, Agrippina's presence was undeniable. She sat alongside him during imperial audiences, a privilege unheard of for a woman. She influenced policy, directed appointments, and received foreign envoys as if she herself were co-ruler. Coins were even minted with her image beside Nero's, a stark indication of her authority. But while she had succeeded in placing her son on the throne, she underestimated the challenges of keeping him under her control. As Nero grew older, he became increasingly resistant to his mother's dominance. Initially, he played the obedient son, deferring to her judgment, but as he settled into the role of emperor, he began to test the limits of her influence. He wanted to be seen as his own man, not as the puppet of a woman, even one as powerful as Agrippina. His personal interests, particularly his love of the arts and his growing indulgence in pleasures, clashed with her vision of a disciplined, tightly controlled ruler. The first major sign of their falling out came when Nero became romantically involved with a former slave girl named Act. Agrippina was outraged. She considered Act far beneath her son's station, a disgrace to the imperial family. More importantly, the relationship represented something more dangerous to her, a shift in Nero's loyalties. He had begun to seek companionship outside of her influence. When Agrippina confronted him, he refused to abandon Act, defying her openly for the first time. From that moment, their relationship began to deteriorate. Agrippina, feeling her grip slipping, sought to reassert control. She threatened to throw her support behind Britannicus, the son of Claudius and a legitimate rival to Nero. But before she could act, Britannicus died suddenly, poisoned at a banquet, just as he was nearing the age at which he could claim the throne. The message was clear: Nero was willing to eliminate any threat to his rule, and not even his mother's favored candidate was safe. With Britannicus gone, Agrippina's options dwindled. She continued to push against Nero's independence, but he began systematically removing her from power. First, he stripped her of the privileges she had enjoyed as the emperor's mother. She was no longer consulted on matters of state. The guards who had once protected her were reassigned. She was even forced to leave the imperial palace and take up residence in a separate villa. As Agrippina's influence waned, Nero's inner circle grew bolder. Seneca and Burrus, once aligned with Agrippina, now saw where the real power lay and sided with the emperor. The Senate, recognizing the shift, followed suit, distancing itself from the former empress. Isolated and humiliated, Agrippina found herself in a precarious position. But she was not one to go down without a fight. She began rallying what support she could, hoping to engineer a political comeback. For Nero, the mere existence of his mother posed a threat. Even stripped of her power, she remained a symbol of opposition. Her lineage still carried weight, and as long as she lived, there was always the risk that a faction of the Senate or the military might attempt to use her as a figurehead in a rebellion. The only solution in his mind was her complete removal. In AD 59, Nero made the fateful decision to have his mother killed. The execution of an empress, let alone his own mother, required careful planning. A public trial or outright assassination would cause too much backlash, so a subtler approach was devised. He invited her to a reconciliation at a villa along the coast, presenting himself as a repentant son seeking forgiveness. To make the act appear accidental, a collapsible boat was designed to sink while Agrippina was on board, drowning her in the process. The plan, however, did not go as expected. Agrippina survived the sinking and swam to shore. This left Nero in an impossible situation. If she had lived, it would be clear that he had tried to kill her. With no other options, he sent assassins to her villa. According to legend, when the soldiers arrived, Agrippina realized what was about to happen. Rather than begging for her life, she is said to have pointed to her womb and told them to strike there first, as if acknowledging that she had given birth to the very man who had ordered her death. With Agrippina dead, Nero had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. News of her passing was carefully managed. The official narrative claimed that she had been plotting against her son and had been executed for treason. The Senate and the military, while shocked, accepted this explanation. There was no significant opposition to her killing. Many had grown weary of her influence, and some even welcomed her removal. Yet, while politically expedient, the murder of Agrippina marked the beginning of a darker phase in Nero's rule. Free from his mother's control, he no longer felt constrained by any form of guidance. He increasingly indulged in extravagance, artistic pursuits, and personal pleasures. Seneca and Burrus, once instrumental in stabilizing his early reign, found themselves increasingly sidelined. The disciplined, promising young emperor gave way to a ruler more concerned with theater, music, and lavish spectacles than with governance. More importantly, the killing of his mother had a psychological effect on him. Ancient sources describe him as being haunted by her death, seeing her ghost and hearing her voice in the night. While such accounts may be exaggerated, they suggest that Nero was not entirely at peace with his actions. Whether out of guilt or simply to deflect public attention, he threw himself deeper into entertainment, hosting grand games and festivals to keep the people distracted. The removal of Agrippina also sent a clear message to those around him. Nero was willing to go to any lengths to protect his rule. This newfound ruthlessness made him more feared, but also more isolated. Advisors became cautious, fearing that they too could be discarded if they displeased him. The Senate, once hopeful that Nero would be a cooperative ruler, grew wary of his unpredictability. Her death also had consequences beyond Rome. In the provinces, governors and military officials who had once seen Agrippina as a stabilizing force now had to contend with an emperor whose whims could change at any moment. The power dynamics in the empire had shifted, and the consequences of Nero's unrestrained rule were yet to fully unfold. Agrippina's influence had shaped Nero's early years, but in the end, she had created a ruler she could not control. By placing him on the throne, she had ensured her own downfall. Her death may have secured Nero's power in the short term, but it also marked the turning point at which he abandoned all pretense of moderation. From this moment forward, his reign would be defined not by careful governance, but by excess, paranoia, and an increasing descent into tyranny. Nero's early reign is often remembered as a period of optimism and promise, a time when Rome appeared to flourish under a young and seemingly progressive emperor. Though later accounts would portray him as a tyrant, his initial years on the throne were marked by a series of successful policies, administrative efficiency, and public enthusiasm. This period, often referred to as the golden years of his rule, was heavily influenced by his advisors, Seneca and Burrus, who guided the young emperor toward stability and effective governance. Upon assuming the throne at the age of 16, Nero inherited an empire that was vast, wealthy, and well-organized. His predecessors, particularly Augustus and Claudius, had laid the foundation for a strong bureaucratic system, and for the first few years, Nero appeared to build upon their legacy. One of the most notable aspects of his early administration was his commitment to justice and fair governance. He introduced reforms that aimed to curb corruption among provincial governors and Roman officials, ensuring that they did not exploit the people under their rule. This initiative was well received, particularly in the provinces, where excessive taxation and abuses of power had been a long-standing concern. In Rome, Nero's reign brought about significant improvements in the daily lives of its citizens. He invested in public infrastructure, commissioning new roads, aqueducts, and public buildings. He also focused on improving grain supplies to prevent food shortages, a move that earned him the favor of the lower classes. Unlike many of his predecessors who had been largely detached from the common people, Nero took an active interest in public life, ensuring that citizens saw tangible benefits from his rule. One of the defining features of Nero's early years was his patronage of the arts and public entertainment. Unlike previous emperors, who had primarily been military leaders or administrators, Nero considered himself an artist and a performer. He encouraged literature, music, and theater, inviting poets, playwrights, and musicians to his court. Under his rule, Rome became a cultural hub, with grand festivals and artistic competitions designed to celebrate creativity. He himself participated in performances, singing and playing musical instruments, an unusual practice for an emperor but one that showcased his deep personal interest in the arts. These efforts were not merely personal indulgences, they were also a calculated strategy to win public favor. By providing free entertainment and promoting the arts, Nero solidified his image as a benevolent ruler who cared for the happiness of his people. Theaters, amphitheaters, and circuses flourished, and Rome saw a revival of dramatic and musical performances. He expanded the existing gladiatorial games and chariot races, ensuring that the public remained entertained. In the realm of economic policy, Nero enacted several reforms that were widely regarded as beneficial. He attempted to reduce taxes on the lower classes and introduced measures to limit the financial exploitation of the provinces. He also revised Rome's currency, adjusting the silver content in coinage to stabilize the economy. Although these measures were later criticized by historians, at the time they provided immediate relief to many segments of society. His tax policies, in particular, helped alleviate some of the financial burdens on the working class, earning him the admiration of ordinary citizens. Nero's military and diplomatic policies were another key factor in the success of his early reign. While he lacked personal military experience, he relied on capable generals and advisors to manage Rome's military affairs. One of the most significant conflicts of his reign was the ongoing struggle with Parthia, Rome's powerful eastern neighbor. The control of Armenia had long been a contentious issue between the two empires, and under Nero's rule, a diplomatic resolution was finally reached. His general, Corbulo, successfully managed military operations in the region, and a peace treaty was negotiated that secured Roman influence in Armenia while avoiding a prolonged war. This diplomatic victory strengthened Nero's reputation as a competent leader who could balance military strength with strategic negotiation. In Britain, Rome faced a major challenge when Queen Boudica of the Iceni tribe led a large-scale rebellion against Roman rule. The revolt threatened Roman dominance in the region, as Boudica's forces destroyed several Roman settlements and even sacked Londinium, modern-day London. The situation was dire, but Roman military commanders acted decisively. The governor, Suetonius Paulinus, eventually crushed the rebellion, restoring Roman control over Britain. While Nero was not personally involved in the military campaign, the successful suppression of the revolt reinforced his image as a ruler under whom the empire remained strong and stable. Despite these achievements, Nero's early reign was not without its critics. The Senate, which had hoped for a more traditional, conservative emperor, grew uneasy with his unconventional interests and personal style of governance. His emphasis on the arts, his public performances, and his close relationship with the common people were viewed with suspicion by the aristocracy, who saw these actions as undignified for a Roman emperor. The Senate's discontent, however, was tempered by the fact that Nero largely refrained from direct political confrontations during this period. His advisors, Seneca and Burrus, worked to maintain a balance between the emperor's personal desires and the expectations of the ruling elite, ensuring that Rome remained politically stable. His popularity among the Roman people, however, was undeniable. Unlike many of his predecessors, who had ruled through fear and strict discipline, Nero cultivated an image of generosity and accessibility. He often appeared in public, engaging with citizens and demonstrating an interest in their concerns. He was known to distribute gifts, host elaborate public feasts, and lower the costs of essential goods. This approach endeared him to the masses, who saw him as a refreshing change from the more austere emperors who had preceded him. Another significant aspect of his early reign was his relationship with the Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit responsible for the emperor's security. The loyalty of the Praetorians was crucial for maintaining power, and Nero ensured that they remained well compensated and content. Burrus, the prefect of the guard, played a key role in securing their support, creating an environment where Nero could rule without immediate threats from within his own military forces. As his rule progressed, however, the careful balance that had been maintained during these golden years began to unravel. His increasing desire for independence from his advisors, his personal excesses, and his growing paranoia about threats to his power would eventually lead him down a path of reckless decisions and cruelty. But in the beginning, there was hope that Rome had found an emperor who could blend artistic passion with effective governance, who could maintain the empire's strength while bringing cultural and economic prosperity. For those who lived during this period, Nero was an emperor who embodied the possibility of a new kind of leadership, one that valued artistic expression and public engagement as much as military strength and political power. He was seen as a ruler who could unite Rome through entertainment and cultural revival while still upholding the empire's traditions. In time, this image would crumble, but for a few brief years, Nero's reign seemed to promise a golden age for the Roman Empire. In the initial years of his rule, Nero had been guided by capable advisors who tempered his excesses and ensured that his governance remained stable. However, as time passed, these figures either died, lost influence, or were removed, leaving Nero to indulge in his worst impulses unchecked. The deaths of key figures such as Burrus and the diminishing role of Seneca marked a turning point in Nero's reign, leading to a period of extravagant excess, paranoia, and ruthless elimination of perceived threats. His increasing cruelty and instability would ultimately push Rome toward disaster, with the Great Fire of AD 64 becoming one of the most infamous events associated with his rule. Burrus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, had played a critical role in maintaining stability during the early years of Nero's reign. He was a seasoned military leader who commanded loyalty from the Praetorian Guard, the elite force responsible for the emperor's security. Burrus had been instrumental in guiding Nero's political decisions and restraining some of his more reckless tendencies. However, in AD 62, Burrus died, possibly of natural causes, though some suspected poisoning. His death created a power vacuum that allowed more sinister influences to rise in Nero's court. One of the figures who quickly gained prominence was Tigellinus, a man whose ambitions were matched only by his ruthlessness. Unlike Burrus, who had sought to moderate Nero's excesses, Tigellinus encouraged them. He played to Nero's vanity and paranoia, urging him to see enemies everywhere and eliminate them before they could act against him. Under Tigellinus' influence, the Praetorian Guard became less of a military force loyal to Rome and more of a personal enforcer for Nero's whims. At the same time, Seneca, the philosopher and former advisor to Nero, saw his influence wane. Seneca had once been a guiding force in Nero's administration, advocating for wisdom, restraint, and good governance. However, as Nero grew more independent, and as his tastes leaned more toward indulgence than responsibility, he began to view Seneca as an obstacle rather than an asset. Seneca was gradually pushed out of Nero's inner circle, and in AD 65, he was forced to commit suicide after being accused of conspiracy against the emperor. His death symbolized the end of any meaningful restraint on Nero's rule. Freed from the moderating influence of these advisors, Nero descended further into extravagance. He spent enormous sums on lavish parties, theatrical performances, and artistic pursuits. His obsession with public performances, particularly in music and acting, grew to the point where he forced high-ranking officials and nobles to attend and praise his talent. He dressed in elaborate costumes and performed on stage, an act that was considered highly improper for a Roman emperor. While the general populace may have been entertained, the aristocracy and Senate viewed these actions with increasing disdain. Nero's personal life also reflected his growing instability. His relationship with Poppaea Sabina was one of the most controversial aspects of his reign. Poppaea was an ambitious and cunning woman who had previously been married to Otho, a future emperor himself. She captivated Nero, and he eventually married her after divorcing and exiling his first wife, Claudia Octavia. However, Nero's marriage to Poppaea was not without scandal. She was rumored to have manipulated him into eliminating his mother, Agrippina, who had opposed their union. Eventually, even Poppaea fell victim to Nero's violence. While pregnant with his child, she reportedly died after Nero kicked her in a fit of rage, though some accounts suggest she may have died of natural causes. As Nero's paranoia deepened, he turned on anyone he perceived as a potential threat. Senators, noblemen, and even former allies found themselves accused of treason and executed without trial. The political purges of this period eliminated many of Rome's most capable administrators and leaders, leaving the government increasingly dysfunctional. Nero's disregard for traditional Roman values and his increasing detachment from governance alienated not only the Senate but also the general population. By AD 64, Rome was already in a state of tension. The extravagant spending on Nero's projects, coupled with heavy taxation and political instability, created widespread dissatisfaction. It was in this atmosphere that one of the most devastating events in Roman history occurred, the Great Fire of Rome. On the night of July 18, AD 64, a fire broke out in the shops surrounding the Circus Maximus, a vast chariot racing stadium in the heart of the city. The flames spread rapidly, fueled by wooden structures and the summer heat. The fire raged for 6 days, destroying entire districts and leaving thousands homeless. Some of the wealthiest and most densely populated areas of the city were reduced to ashes, including temples, marketplaces, and public buildings. Historical accounts differ on Nero's role in the fire. Some sources claim that he was in Antium, his birthplace, when the fire started and rushed back to Rome upon hearing the news. Others suggest that he watched from a safe distance as the city burned. The most famous legend, that Nero played the lyre and sang while Rome was engulfed in flames, is almost certainly a myth, likely a product of later historical embellishments. However, the image of Nero, fiddling while Rome burned, became an enduring symbol of his perceived neglect and cruelty. Regardless of whether Nero had any direct involvement in starting the fire, his response to the disaster was deeply controversial. He ordered extensive relief efforts, opening his own palaces to shelter those who had lost their homes and arranging for food supplies to be distributed to the victims. However, his decision to rebuild Rome according to his own grand architectural vision raised suspicions. Instead of restoring the city to its former state, Nero took the opportunity to construct vast new buildings, the most infamous of which was the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. The Domus Aurea was an opulent palace complex unlike anything Rome had seen before. Spanning a vast area, it featured luxurious gardens, artificial lakes, and extravagant decorations. A colossal statue of Nero himself, known as the Colossus of Nero, was erected near the palace, further reinforcing his self-image as a godlike figure. The sheer scale and extravagance of the project led many to believe that Nero had deliberately set fire to Rome in order to clear space for his palace. While there is no concrete evidence to support this claim, the suspicion alone severely damaged his reputation. Faced with growing public anger, Nero sought a scapegoat to divert blame. He turned his attention to the Christians, a small but growing religious sect that was often viewed with suspicion by mainstream Roman society. Nero accused the Christians of starting the fire and launched one of the first official persecutions against them. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in brutal fashion. Some were burned alive, others were thrown to wild animals in the arena, and some were crucified. This persecution set a precedent for later Roman policies toward Christianity. Although Christianity was still a minor religion at the time, Nero's actions inadvertently contributed to its later growth. The stories of Christian martyrs who suffered under Nero became powerful symbols of faith and resistance, and in later centuries, Nero would be remembered as one of the greatest enemies of Christianity. Despite his attempts to shift the blame, Nero's popularity continued to decline after the fire. The people of Rome, already discontent with his extravagant spending and erratic behavior, now viewed him with suspicion and resentment. The Senate, which had long tolerated Nero's excesses out of necessity, began to turn against him. His failure to maintain political stability, combined with his increasing reliance on cruelty and repression, made him a liability to the Roman elite. In the years following the Great Fire, Nero's grip on power weakened. Revolts broke out in the provinces, discontent spread among the military, and even the Praetorian Guard, once his staunchest supporters, began to lose faith in him. As his rule unraveled, Nero became increasingly erratic, retreating further into his artistic fantasies and paranoia. The once promising emperor who had ushered in a golden age of cultural revival had become a despised tyrant, setting the stage for his eventual downfall. His descent into madness, betrayal, and ultimate suicide would mark one of the most dramatic ends to a Roman emperor's reign. But the events of AD 64, the Great Fire, the Domus Aurea, and the persecution of Christians, would forever define his legacy, ensuring that Nero would be remembered not as a benevolent ruler, but as one of history's most infamous despots. The year AD 64 would prove to be a defining moment in the reign of Nero. On the night of July 18th, a devastating fire broke out in the shops surrounding the Circus Maximus, a vast entertainment complex in the heart of Rome. The flames spread rapidly through the city, consuming wooden structures and leaping from district to district. For 6 days, the fire raged uncontrollably, with efforts to contain it proving futile. Just as it seemed to be dying down, it reignited and burned for another 3 days. By the time the fire was finally extinguished, nearly 2/3 of Rome had been reduced to ashes. Ancient accounts differ on how the fire began. Some sources suggest it was an accident, possibly caused by cooking fires or an unattended lamp in the merchant districts. Others hint at more sinister explanations, including arson. Regardless of its origins, the destruction it caused was unprecedented. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out, temples and public buildings collapsed, and thousands of people were left homeless. The destruction of religious sites was particularly distressing to the Romans, who saw it as a sign of divine wrath. The fire left Rome in ruins, creating a deep crisis that required immediate leadership. Nero was not in Rome when the fire began. He was at his villa in Antium, a coastal town south of the city, when news of the blaze reached him. Upon hearing of the disaster, he quickly returned to Rome and personally oversaw relief efforts. He opened the doors of his private gardens and the imperial palace to shelter the displaced. He arranged for food to be distributed at reduced prices to those affected by the fire. He also ordered the construction of temporary shelters to house the homeless. His response was swift, and he took an active role in ensuring that aid reached the victims. However, despite these efforts, rumors began to circulate that he had either done too little or, worse, had deliberately started the fire. One of the most enduring myths associated with the Great Fire is that of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. The image of the emperor playing music while his city was in flames has become a powerful symbol of detached and incompetent leadership. However, this story is almost certainly a later fabrication. The fiddle did not even exist in ancient Rome. The closest instrument was the lyre, which Nero was known to play. Some accounts suggest that he may have sung about the destruction of Troy while watching the fire from a safe vantage point, but this remains speculative. The idea of Nero composing poetry or music during the fire was likely exaggerated by later historians who sought to emphasize his perceived indifference and excess. What is certain is that Nero took advantage of the destruction to implement a grand reconstruction plan for Rome. He introduced new building regulations requiring wider streets, better fireproofing measures, and more organized urban planning to prevent such a catastrophe from happening again. However, one of the most controversial aspects of his rebuilding efforts was the construction of the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. The Domus Aurea was an extravagant palace complex that spanned a vast area of central Rome. It featured sprawling gardens, artificial lakes, and lavish decorations, including walls inlaid with gold and precious stones. The most striking feature was a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, known as the Colossus of Nero. The sheer scale of the project fueled suspicions that Nero had started the fire deliberately to clear space for his dream palace. Whether this was true or not, the perception alone was enough to damage his reputation. As public anger mounted, Nero sought a scapegoat to divert blame. He turned his attention to the Christian community, a small but growing religious sect that was already viewed with suspicion by mainstream Roman society. Christians were often misunderstood, accused of secretive and subversive practices, and distrusted for their refusal to worship traditional Roman gods. Nero capitalized on these fears by accusing Christians of arson and ordering brutal punishments. Many were arrested and subjected to horrific executions. Some were burned alive as human torches to light Nero's gardens, others were thrown to wild animals in public spectacles, and some were crucified. This persecution marked one of the first official actions taken against Christians in Roman history. While Christianity was still a minor religion at the time, the stories of those who suffered under Nero's orders would later become an important part of Christian martyrdom. His association with their persecution would ensure that his name lived on in infamy, particularly in Christian writings. Even as Rome recovered from the fire and public dissatisfaction grew, Nero remained more absorbed in his personal passions than in matters of governance. His fascination with music, poetry, and theater became one of the defining aspects of his rule. Unlike previous emperors, who upheld the image of a dignified and militaristic ruler, Nero saw himself as an artist first and an emperor second. He was deeply passionate about the arts and considered himself a talented musician, poet, and actor. He composed music, wrote poetry, and performed publicly, often forcing members of the Roman elite to attend his recitals. This obsession with artistic expression was unusual for a Roman emperor. While artistic patronage was common, active participation in performance was seen as beneath the dignity of an emperor. Nero, however, dismissed such concerns and immersed himself in the artistic world. One of his greatest ambitions was to gain recognition as a performer. He staged elaborate musical and theatrical productions in which he himself took center stage. He played the lyre, recited poetry, and acted in dramatic performances. He saw these pursuits not just as hobbies but as his true calling. His performances were not voluntary events for the audience. High-ranking officials, senators, and noblemen were required to attend and praise his talent, regardless of their true opinions. To further his artistic aspirations, Nero participated in the Greek games and festivals, including the prestigious Olympic Games. In Greece, artistic performance was more respected than in Rome, and Nero saw an opportunity to be recognized as a great artist. He entered various competitions, including singing, acting, and chariot racing. Predictably, he won every event he participated in, even in cases where he performed poorly. In one infamous incident, he competed in a chariot race but fell from his chariot and was unable to finish. Despite this, he was still declared the winner. His obsession with performance was met with deep resentment by the Roman elite. The Senate and traditional aristocracy viewed his artistic pursuits as a disgrace to the imperial office. Roman values emphasized military prowess, political leadership, and civic duty, none of which Nero seemed particularly interested in. Instead, he spent his time composing songs, rehearsing plays, and staging grand spectacles. His behavior alienated the ruling class, who saw him as unfit to lead the empire. The public reaction to Nero's artistic endeavors was more mixed. Some members of the lower classes may have enjoyed the entertainment he provided, especially as he invested heavily in public performances and games. However, his insistence on forcing admiration as well as his extravagance at a time of economic strain led to widespread discontent. His performances also had practical consequences for governance. Because he insisted on personally participating in artistic competitions, he spent long periods away from Rome touring Greece. During these extended absences, the administration of the empire suffered and instability grew. His disregard for traditional governance created an opportunity for conspiracies and revolts to emerge. By the later years of his reign, Nero's detachment from political realities had reached dangerous levels. His focus on artistic glory had blinded him to the growing unrest within the empire. Revolts began to break out, particularly in the provinces, where military commanders and governors saw an opportunity to challenge his rule. Even the Praetorian Guard, which had once been loyal to him, began to waver in its support. Ultimately, his obsession with the arts, coupled with his mismanagement of Rome after the Great Fire and his brutal purges of political rivals, contributed to his downfall. The growing dissatisfaction within the military, Senate, and general populace set the stage for rebellion. As his support crumbled, he would face a dramatic and tragic end, marking the close of one of the most infamous reigns in Roman history. His artistic ambitions, though genuine, had ultimately made him more of a spectacle than a ruler. Instead of being remembered as a great performer, he would be remembered as a tyrant who neglected the empire in pursuit of personal glory. His reign, once full of promise, ended in chaos and destruction, ensuring that his legacy would remain one of the most controversial in Roman history. By AD 65, Nero's rule had become increasingly unstable. His early reign, once guided by wise advisors such as Seneca and Burrus, had now devolved into paranoia, cruelty, and unchecked extravagance. With the death of Burrus and the diminishing influence of Seneca, Nero was left to govern with sycophantic advisors who encouraged his worst instincts. This atmosphere of suspicion and fear eventually led to the exposure of the Pisonian conspiracy, one of the most significant plots against Nero's life. The Pisonian conspiracy was a complex scheme led by Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a senator who had grown disillusioned with Nero's excesses and disregard for traditional Roman values. Piso was an influential figure with considerable support among Rome's elite. He gathered a coalition of senators, equestrians, and even members of the Praetorian Guard who wished to see Nero deposed. The plot was ambitious. Piso and his supporters planned to assassinate Nero and replace him with Piso, who promised to restore stability to Rome. The conspiracy unraveled when one of the participants, a soldier named Milicus, betrayed the plan. He reported the plot to Nero's officials, leading to a swift and brutal crackdown. Dozens of suspected conspirators were arrested, tortured, and executed. Among them was Seneca, who, although possibly uninvolved, was too influential to be allowed to live. Nero had long been wary of Seneca's lingering influence. The philosopher had been his tutor, mentor, and chief advisor, shaping Nero's early reign with principles of Stoic philosophy and moderation. However, as Nero's rule became increasingly tyrannical, Seneca withdrew from public life, preferring to live in seclusion. Despite his retreat from politics, Nero remained suspicious of him, fearing that his former advisors still wielded significant moral authority over Rome's elite. The Pisonian conspiracy gave Nero the perfect excuse to eliminate him. Seneca was ordered to take his own life, a fate reminiscent of the great Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero during the days of Augustus. In true Stoic fashion, Seneca accepted his death with calm resignation. He attempted to open his veins, but his old age and poor health slowed the bleeding. To speed up the process, he drank poison, but it too failed to act quickly. Finally, he was placed in a hot bath, a traditional method of easing the flow of blood, until he succumbed. His wife, Paulina, attempted to die alongside him, but Nero's guards intervened, allowing her to live. The death of Seneca marked a turning point in Nero's rule. If there had been any pretense of moderation left, it was now gone. The execution of Seneca was followed by a wave of purges. Those suspected of disloyalty, including senators, noblemen, and military officers, were arrested and put to death. Some were executed publicly as a warning to others, while others were forced to commit suicide in private. Among the notable figures who perished in this period was the poet Lucan, Seneca's nephew, who was also implicated in the conspiracy. Nero's growing paranoia led to an atmosphere of fear throughout Rome. Informants were everywhere, and accusations of treason were often enough to result in execution. Even the most loyal supporters of Nero were not safe. His increasing reliance on violence to maintain control alienated not only the Senate but also the military and the provincial governors. The empire, once held together by careful political maneuvering, was now ruled by fear. At the same time, Nero's foreign policy faced serious challenges. One of the most significant conflicts of his reign was the war with Parthia over control of Armenia. The Kingdom of Armenia had long been a buffer state between Rome and the Parthian Empire, and both powers sought to install rulers loyal to their interests. In AD 58, Roman general Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo launched a campaign to assert Roman control over Armenia. Corbulo was a capable and respected commander who achieved significant military success, defeating the Parthian-backed King Tiridates and installing a pro-Roman ruler, Tigranes VI, on the Armenian throne. However, Parthia was not willing to accept this outcome. In AD 62, they launched a counteroffensive, and the Roman response under Lucius Caecilius Paetus was disastrous. Paetus suffered a humiliating defeat and was forced to surrender at the Battle of Randia. To avoid a prolonged conflict, a diplomatic solution was reached. The Parthian king Valigases I agreed that Tiridates would return to the Armenian throne but would travel to Rome to receive his crown personally from Nero. Nero saw this as a political victory. In AD 66, Tiridates arrived in Rome and was crowned by Nero in a grand ceremony. This act symbolized Rome's dominance while also allowing Parthia to maintain influence over Armenia. Despite the diplomatic resolution, many in the military saw Nero's handling of the conflict as weak. The contrast between Corbulo's military success and Paetus' failure further undermined Nero's standing among his generals. Another major crisis of Nero's reign was the Boudiccan rebellion in Britain. In AD 60, the Roman governor of Britain, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was leading a military campaign in Wales when rebellion broke out in the eastern part of the province. The revolt was led by Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, whose husband, King Prasutagus, had been a Roman ally. Upon his death, the Romans ignored his will, which had left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and Rome. Instead, Roman officials seized Iceni land, confiscated property from noble families, and brutally mistreated Boudica and her daughters. Enraged by this treatment, Boudica rallied her people and formed an alliance with other discontented tribes. The rebels launched a devastating assault on Roman settlements, including the city of Camulodunum, modern Colchester, which was completely destroyed. They then marched on Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans, massacring the inhabitants and burning the cities to the ground. The rebellion caught the Romans off guard, as most of their forces were still engaged in Wales. However, when Suetonius Paulinus returned with reinforcements, he confronted Boudica's forces at an unknown location, possibly along the Watling Street. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Roman army, disciplined and well-trained, decisively defeated the rebels. Boudica is believed to have either taken poison or died of illness shortly after the battle. While the Romans ultimately crushed the rebellion, the revolt highlighted the fragile nature of their control over Britain. It also exposed weaknesses in Nero's administration, as poor provincial governance had led to unnecessary unrest. The brutal Roman response to the rebellion, which included mass executions and harsh reprisals against the local population, left a lasting impact on the region. Beyond Britain and Parthia, Nero's handling of provincial affairs was inconsistent. He relied heavily on trusted governors to maintain stability, but his increasing detachment from military matters led to growing resentment among Rome's legions. Roman soldiers expected an emperor who demonstrated leadership, military prowess, and personal involvement in their campaigns. Nero, however, was far more interested in artistic performances than in military discipline. His neglect of the army led to a decline in morale and loyalty among the troops. This dissatisfaction among the military would prove critical in the final years of Nero's reign. Provincial governors, who traditionally supported the emperor, began questioning his competence. Many saw him as unworthy of ruling an empire that required strong leadership. This resentment would eventually culminate in open rebellion, as military commanders turned against Nero and sought to replace him with someone they deemed more capable. Nero's decline was not solely due to military failures or political purges, but rather a combination of his paranoia, cruelty, and detachment from the realities of ruling an empire. His obsession with personal grandeur and artistic pursuits alienated the very institutions that had once supported him. The Senate despised him for his tyranny, the military resented him for his neglect, and the people of Rome, once enamored with his public performances, grew weary of his extravagance. As his support eroded, the empire teetered on the edge of chaos. The purges and executions that had once silenced his critics now only fueled further opposition. The cracks in Nero's rule were becoming too large to ignore, setting the stage for his eventual downfall. The empire, once a vast and stable dominion, was now a political battleground where Nero's enemies were growing in number and strength. The final years of his reign would be marked by desperation, betrayal, and the inevitable collapse of his rule. Nero had once enjoyed the favor of the Roman people, particularly in the early years of his reign, when he presented himself as a patron of the arts, a benefactor of the masses, and a ruler who valued spectacle and public engagement. However, as the years passed, the image he had carefully cultivated began to erode. His increasingly erratic behavior, economic mismanagement, and political purges had created deep resentment among Rome's elite, the provinces, and even the people who had once celebrated him. The final years of his reign would be marked by rising discontent, culminating in a series of rebellions that would ultimately lead to his downfall. One of the most significant sources of public discontent was Nero's financial policies. His lavish expenditures on personal pleasures, extravagant games, and monumental architectural projects drained the imperial treasury. The most infamous of these was the Domus Aurea, or the Golden House, a sprawling palace that Nero constructed in the aftermath of the Great Fire of Rome. Covering a vast portion of the city, this palace was adorned with gold, precious stones, and intricate frescoes, with an artificial lake and lush gardens. While Nero saw this as a testament to his artistic vision and imperial grandeur, the Roman people saw it as an outrageous symbol of excess, particularly at a time when the city was struggling to rebuild after the fire. To fund his extravagant lifestyle, Nero implemented heavy taxation and resorted to increasingly desperate measures to extract wealth from the empire. He confiscated property from wealthy citizens under the pretext of treason, selling off their assets to fill the state's coffers. He devalued the currency, reducing the silver content in Roman coins, which led to inflation and economic instability. Merchants and landowners suffered, and the burden of high taxes fell disproportionately on the provinces, where governors were expected to meet Nero's demands for revenue. Corruption flourished under Nero's rule as his inner circle, composed of sycophantic advisors and officials, exploited their positions for personal gain. The Senate, already weakened and marginalized, had little ability to resist Nero's financial policies, and many of its members either submitted to his rule out of fear or sought ways to undermine him behind the scenes. Provincial governors, particularly those who had once been loyal, grew frustrated with Nero's endless demands and lack of interest in military and administrative affairs. The empire's financial instability, coupled with widespread corruption, created fertile ground for opposition. As dissatisfaction spread, the political elite in Rome began to voice their concerns more openly. The Senate, once hesitant to challenge the emperor directly, became a hotbed of quiet resistance. Senators who had once supported Nero now saw him as a liability to the stability of the empire. Many of them had already suffered personal losses due to his purges and financial seizures, and their patience was wearing thin. Meanwhile, in the provinces, military commanders and governors who had been tasked with maintaining order saw their own authority threatened by Nero's reckless policies. The loss of public support was perhaps the most dangerous shift for Nero. The people of Rome, who had once delighted in his performances and generosity, began to turn against him. While his early years had been marked by extravagant public games, food distributions, and grand spectacles, his later years were dominated by personal indulgences that had little to do with the welfare of the masses. The economic strain on the empire meant that fewer resources were allocated to public projects, and as inflation increased, the cost of living in Rome became unbearable for many. The perception that Nero was no longer acting in the interest of the Roman people fueled resentment. Rumors and conspiracies against Nero began to circulate more frequently. The Pisonian conspiracy of AD 65 had already revealed that elements within the Senate and the military were willing to plot against him, and though Nero had crushed that rebellion, it only deepened his paranoia. He responded with even greater cruelty, executing perceived enemies and increasing his reliance on informants to root out opposition. This further alienated the Senate and the military, as even his closest allies feared that they might be the next victims of his purges. As tensions mounted, the empire reached a breaking point in AD 68 when rebellion erupted in the provinces. The first major uprising was led by Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, modern-day France. Vindex, a member of the provincial elite, had grown tired of Nero's oppressive taxation and misrule. Unlike previous plots against the emperor, which had been limited to Rome's political circles, this was an open revolt that sought to depose Nero and replace him with a more competent leader. Vindex's rebellion was not merely an act of defiance against Nero's financial policies, it was a direct challenge to his legitimacy as emperor. Vindex called upon other provincial leaders to join his cause, arguing that Nero had lost the right to rule. While Vindex himself did not seek the throne, he hoped to elevate someone who could restore order to the empire. He found a potential ally in Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, modern Spain. Galba, a seasoned military commander with a strong reputation, had initially been hesitant to defy Nero, but as the situation in Rome deteriorated, he saw an opportunity to position himself as the leader of a new government. Nero, upon learning of the rebellion, was furious but initially dismissed it as an isolated incident. He underestimated the extent of dissatisfaction within the provinces and assumed that the revolt would be easily crushed. However, as news spread, it became clear that Vindex was not acting alone. More governors and military leaders began to question their loyalty to Nero, and support for Galba grew. The Senate, sensing the shifting tides, also began to distance itself from the emperor. The final blow came when the Praetorian Guard, the elite military force responsible for protecting the emperor, turned against him. Throughout Roman history, the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard had been essential for an emperor's survival. However, Nero's neglect of the military and his failure to maintain discipline had alienated them. The guards, seeing an opportunity for political and financial gain, declared their support for Galba. Nero's authority collapsed almost overnight. Realizing that he had lost control, he fled the city in a desperate attempt to regroup. He considered various courses of action, fleeing to Egypt, seeking refuge among loyal legions, or even attempting to reclaim Rome by force, but none of these plans were realistic. His options dwindled as one by one, his allies abandoned him. The Senate, which had once been afraid to openly oppose Nero, formally declared him an enemy of the state. This act was unprecedented for a reigning emperor, marking the end of his rule. His last days were filled with panic and despair as he sought refuge outside of Rome. Eventually, he took shelter in the villa of his freedman Phaon, where he was accompanied by a few loyal attendants. As the Senate and Galba's forces closed in, Nero was left with no choice but to take his own life. Even in his final moments, he struggled with the reality of his downfall. According to historical accounts, he hesitated, unable to summon the courage to commit suicide. It was only when he heard approaching soldiers that he finally acted, with the help of his companion Epaphroditus. His last words, as reported by historians, were said to be, "Qualis artifex perio." What an artist dies in me. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty came to an end. His downfall marked a turning point in Roman history, as the empire plunged into a period of civil war and instability. Galba assumed the throne, but his rule would be short-lived, as Rome soon descended into the chaotic year of the four emperors. Nero's legacy remains one of the most controversial in Roman history. While some view him as a mad tyrant whose excesses led to the empire's decline, others see him as a misunderstood ruler whose artistic vision and cultural ambitions were ahead of his time. His reign serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power, the fragility of political alliances, and the consequences of neglecting the very institutions that sustain an empire. As the rebellion against Nero spread and support for Galba grew, the once mighty emperor found himself increasingly isolated. The Senate, which had long endured his erratic behavior, formally declared him a public enemy. This was an unprecedented move against a sitting emperor, effectively stripping him of his authority and sealing his fate. The Praetorian Guard, once fiercely loyal to Nero, had also abandoned him, enticed by promises of rewards from Galba. Even the common people of Rome, who had once been entertained by Nero's extravagant spectacles, had grown indifferent or hostile toward their ruler. With his power crumbling, Nero fled the imperial palace under the cover of darkness. He sought refuge among his few remaining allies, but many refused to help him, fearing the consequences of being associated with a fallen emperor. He eventually found temporary sanctuary at the villa of his freedman Phaon, located just outside Rome. Disguised and accompanied by a handful of attendants, Nero rode through the city, encountering ominous signs of his downfall. At one point, he heard a passerby comment on his dire situation, and in a moment of despair, he muttered to himself that Rome had abandoned him. At Phaon's villa, Nero's mental state deteriorated further. He vacillated between defiance and self-pity, considering various options, pleading for mercy from Galba, fleeing to the eastern provinces, or even attempting to rally the few remaining troops still loyal to him. None of these options were realistic. His isolation became more apparent when a messenger arrived with news that the Senate had officially sentenced him to death. Terrified at the prospect of execution, Nero realized that the end was near. Despite the inevitability of his fate, he struggled with the idea of taking his own life. He asked his attendants to set an example by killing themselves first, but none obeyed. In his final moments, he lamented his fall from power, fixating on the idea that his artistic legacy would be lost. His famous last words, "What an artist dies in me," reflected his belief that he had been more than just a ruler. He had been a performer, a visionary, and a creator. As soldiers approached the villa, Nero finally found the courage to act. With the assistance of his loyal freedman Epaphroditus, he plunged a dagger into his throat. When the soldiers arrived, they found him barely alive, but he soon succumbed to his wound. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty came to an end. The empire was left in chaos, as there was no clear successor to the throne. Galba, having declared himself emperor with the backing of the Senate and the legions in Hispania, marched toward Rome to claim power. However, his reign would be short-lived, as Rome descended into a year of political turmoil and civil war. The period following Nero's death is known as the Year of the Four Emperors, a time of instability in which multiple claimants vied for control of the empire. Galba, the first to seize power, quickly found himself unpopular. His strict policies and refusal to reward the Praetorian Guard for their betrayal of Nero led to widespread resentment. Otho, an ambitious rival, exploited this discontent and orchestrated a coup, seizing the throne for himself. Otho's rule, however, was immediately challenged by Vitellius, a general with the support of powerful legions from the German provinces. As civil war erupted, Otho's forces were defeated, and he took his own life to avoid further bloodshed. Vitellius then assumed power, but his reign was marked by disorder and brutality. Meanwhile, in the eastern provinces, a new contender emerged, Vespasian, a seasoned military commander who had gained prominence during Rome's wars in Judea. Vespasian's supporters rallied behind him, and as his legions marched on Rome, Vitellius's grip on power weakened. The final battle for control of the empire was brutal, with Rome itself suffering from violent clashes between rival factions. Eventually, Vespasian's forces prevailed, and Vitellius was executed. Vespasian's ascension marked the beginning of the Flavian dynasty and the restoration of stability to the empire. Nero's legacy was systematically erased by the new regime. His grand palace, the Domus Aurea, was partially destroyed, with some of its land repurposed for public use. The Colosseum, one of Rome's most iconic structures, was later built on the site of what had once been part of Nero's palace, a symbolic act meant to erase his excesses and replace them with something for the people. The Flavian rulers also took part in rewriting history, portraying Nero as a mad tyrant whose reign had brought nothing but suffering to Rome. While his faults were many, this revisionist approach ignored the early years of his reign, when he had been a popular and competent ruler. Nero's passion for the arts, his patronage of Greek culture, and his ambitious architectural projects were downplayed or condemned as further proof of his vanity and madness. Despite this official condemnation, Nero's memory did not entirely fade. In the provinces, particularly in the eastern parts of the empire, there were those who still revered him. Rumors circulated that Nero had not truly died, and impostors claiming to be the deposed emperor occasionally emerged, hoping to rally support. These so-called false Neros were a testament to the lingering fascination with his reign, as well as the instability that followed his downfall. Ultimately, Nero's reign and the chaos that followed underscored the fragile nature of absolute power in Rome. His downfall was not simply the result of personal failings but a reflection of deeper tensions within the empire, between the Senate and the emperor, between the provinces and Rome, between military power and political authority. His death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, one in which the empire would continue to grapple with the balance between autocracy and governance. Even centuries later, Nero remains one of the most infamous figures in Roman history. Whether he is remembered as a monster or as a misunderstood visionary depends on the perspective one takes. But one thing is certain, his reign left an indelible mark on Rome, shaping its political and cultural landscape long after he was gone. Nero's suicide in AD 68 marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, throwing the Roman Empire into a state of unprecedented turmoil. For the first time, Rome found itself without a clear successor, and various factions scrambled to fill the power vacuum. What followed was a year of instability, bloodshed, and rapid changes in leadership, known as the Year of the Four Emperors. This period would redefine the future of Rome and set the stage for the rise of the Flavian dynasty. The first man to claim the imperial title after Nero was Galba, the governor of Hispania. His bid for power had been one of the key reasons for Nero's downfall, as his rebellion had encouraged the Senate and the Praetorian Guard to turn against the last Julio-Claudian emperor. As Galba entered Rome, he was met with initial support from the Senate and the elite, but his rule quickly soured. Unlike Nero, who had cultivated popularity among the people through lavish games and entertainment, Galba was austere and frugal. He refused to pay the promised rewards to the Praetorian Guard, who had played a crucial role in overthrowing Nero. His reluctance to grant financial incentives alienated the military, while his harsh crackdowns on suspected opponents further eroded his support. Galba's unpopularity paved the way for his downfall. Otho, a former ally of Nero and an ambitious noble, saw an opportunity to seize power. In early AD 69, Otho orchestrated a coup with the backing of the Praetorian Guard. Galba was assassinated in the streets of Rome, his head paraded through the city as Otho was declared the new emperor. However, Otho's rule was immediately challenged by Vitellius, a general commanding powerful legions in Germania. The legions declared their loyalty to Vitellius and marched toward Rome, leading to a civil war. Otho, despite his efforts to maintain power, was defeated at the Battle of Bedriacum. Recognizing that further conflict would only lead to more bloodshed, he chose to take his own life, ending his reign after just 3 months. Vitellius assumed the imperial title, but his rule was marked by excess, disorder, and brutality. His lavish feasts and reckless spending drained the treasury, and his attempts to eliminate rivals only created more enemies. Meanwhile, in the eastern provinces, a new contender emerged. Vespasian, a seasoned general known for his campaigns in Judea, had been quietly amassing support. Unlike his predecessors, Vespasian was a pragmatic leader who understood the importance of securing military backing before making a claim to the throne. His legions declared him emperor, and as he marched toward Rome, Vitellius's support crumbled. After a bloody battle in the capital, Vitellius was captured and executed, and Vespasian was officially recognized as emperor, bringing an end to the chaotic year of the four emperors. The rise of Vespasian marked the beginning of the Flavian dynasty and a new era of stability. However, one of his first acts as emperor was to distance himself from Nero and the Julio-Claudian legacy. Nero's vast and extravagant palace, the Domus Aurea, was seen as a symbol of tyranny and excess. Vespasian ordered large portions of it to be destroyed or repurposed, using the land to construct public buildings, including the Colosseum. This was a strategic move to win public favor, as it demonstrated that the new emperor was prioritizing the needs of the people over personal indulgence. The destruction of Nero's legacy was not limited to architecture. The Flavian rulers, along with later emperors, actively reshaped the historical narrative to portray Nero as a villain. Ancient historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, writing in the years after Nero's death, contributed to this image by emphasizing his excesses, cruelty, and misrule. They painted him as a madman who had squandered Rome's wealth, persecuted the innocent, and burned the city for his own amusement. While some of these accounts may have been exaggerated or politically motivated, they became the dominant portrayal of Nero in historical memory. Throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods, Nero's reputation remained largely negative. Christian writers, in particular, vilified him as the emperor who had persecuted early Christians, blaming them for the Great Fire of Rome. He was sometimes depicted as the Antichrist or a symbol of moral decay. In Dante's Inferno, Nero is placed among the damned, reinforcing the idea that he was a ruler condemned for his sins. Despite this overwhelmingly negative portrayal, there were occasional attempts to reassess Nero's legacy. Some Renaissance scholars, fascinated by the cultural achievements of ancient Rome, acknowledged that Nero had been a patron of the arts and a lover of Greek culture. However, this did little to counterbalance his reputation as a tyrant. In modern times, historians have taken a more nuanced approach to Nero's reign. While acknowledging his extravagance and failures, some scholars argue that he was not the monstrous figure that later writers made him out to be. His early years as emperor were marked by competent governance, and he implemented policies that benefited the common people. His patronage of the arts, while controversial, reflected a genuine interest in culture and creativity. Additionally, some of the accusations against him, such as the claim that he played music while Rome burned, have been debunked as myths. Nero's complex legacy has also been explored in literature, theater, and film. He has been depicted as both a villain and a tragic figure, with some interpretations emphasizing his artistic ambitions and others highlighting his descent into madness. Novels such as Henryk Sienkiewicz's Quo Vadis have reinforced the traditional image of Nero as a cruel tyrant, while other works have presented more sympathetic portrayals. Ultimately, the question of whether Nero was truly a villain or a misunderstood ruler remains open to interpretation. While his reign ended in chaos and his actions contributed to his downfall, he was also a product of his time, an emperor navigating the challenges of absolute power in a volatile political environment. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority, the complexities of leadership, and the ways in which history is shaped by those who write it. Nero's life and reign remain one of the most controversial and debated periods in Roman history. Rising to power as a young emperor at just 16, he inherited a vast empire with immense responsibilities. His early years were marked by promise, guided by experienced advisors like Seneca and Burrus, but as he grew more independent, his rule became increasingly erratic. His reign saw great artistic and cultural patronage, as well as disastrous political and economic decisions that ultimately led to his downfall. The contradictions in Nero's character, his love for the arts, his political paranoia, his cruelty toward opponents, and his moments of generosity, make him one of the most enigmatic figures of the ancient world. Nero's rule teaches valuable lessons about leadership, governance, and the consequences of unchecked power. Initially, he showed promise as a ruler who could balance political obligations with a passion for the arts. However, as he distanced himself from his early advisors and embraced a more autocratic style of governance, he became increasingly detached from the realities of ruling an empire. His reliance on personal indulgences, extravagant spending, and his persecution of perceived enemies created deep fractures within the Roman state. His rule exemplifies how absolute power, when combined with insecurity and excess, can lead to self-destruction. One of the greatest lessons from Nero's reign is the danger of ignoring the responsibilities of leadership. While he may have seen himself as a patron of culture and a visionary, his neglect of economic and military stability weakened Rome. His persecution of political rivals and inability to maintain the loyalty of the Senate and the Praetorian Guard ultimately sealed his fate. By the time revolts began against him, there were few left willing to defend his rule. His downfall serves as a stark reminder that even the most powerful rulers can fall if they lose the support of those they govern. Despite his failures, Nero's influence on history is undeniable. His reign left a lasting mark on Roman culture, particularly in the arts and architecture. His passion for music, poetry, and performance, while mocked by the elite, shaped how later emperors engaged with culture. His ambitious architectural projects, including the Domus Aurea, demonstrated his vision for a grander Rome, even though they also contributed to his reputation for extravagance. The destruction of his memory by subsequent rulers, particularly the Flavians, further complicated his legacy. Much of what we know about Nero comes from historians who wrote after his death, often with political motives. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio painted him as a tyrant, ensuring that his name would be associated with excess and cruelty for centuries. While there is no doubt that he made grave mistakes, modern historians question whether he was as monstrous as his enemies claimed. Some argue that Nero was a victim of political propaganda, while others see him as a deeply flawed leader who simply lost control. In popular culture, Nero has remained a figure of fascination. He has been depicted in literature, film, and theater as both a cruel despot and a tragic, misunderstood ruler. His association with the Great Fire of Rome and the persecution of Christians has made him a symbol of tyranny, yet some portrayals have attempted to explore his human side. His famous last words, "What an artist dies in me," reflect the way he viewed himself, not as a failed ruler, but as a creative spirit who never found his place in the political world. Ultimately, Nero's place in Roman history is one of complexity. He was neither the great leader he aspired to be nor the absolute villain that history often remembers him as. His reign was a mixture of ambition, cultural achievements, political missteps, and tragic downfall. His story continues to captivate historians and scholars, serving as a timeless study of the dangers of power, the impact of leadership, and the ways in which history remembers, or misremembers, its most infamous figures.